He wrote that time is the only thing no one can give back, that most people only realize they've lived when it's already too late, that we don't have a short life. We waste most of it, and 2,000 years later, no one has been able to prove him wrong. His words crossed empires, revolutions, wars. They survived everything, made it here, and they keep bothering us because they keep being true. But there's a detail about this man's life, a detail almost no one mentions. That completely changes the meaning of everything he taught. And when you know what it is, you'll have to decide whether he was a genius or the greatest hypocrite philosophy ever produced. To understand who Seneca really was, you first need to understand the world that created him. Because no one is born a philosopher. No one wakes up one day and decides to write about death, fate, and the brevity of life, without something having broken first. And Seneca's world was a world that broke people. But before entering that world, you need to know what's at stake. Because this man's story raises an accusation that 2,000 years haven't been able to resolve. Seneca preached material detachment while accumulating one of the largest fortunes in Rome. He wrote about virtue and Stoic ethics. While serving as advisor to an emperor he knew was becoming tyrannical, he taught control of human passions and tranquility of the soul, while participating in the bloodiest intrigues of imperial power. And in the darkest moment, he didn't stay silent. He did worse. He used his talent to make the unacceptable presentable. The accusation of philosophical hypocrisy against Seneca isn't one of silence. It's of the man who knows what's right, teaches what's right, and still makes concessions that contradict everything he taught. But is it really that simple? Can a man's life be judged without understanding the world that surrounded him? To answer, we need to go back to the beginning. We're talking about Rome, not the Rome of movies. Clean, glorious, monumental. The real Rome. A power machine so vast, so brutal, and so sophisticated that it shaped practically everything the West would become. In the 1st century of the Common Era, the Roman Empire controlled more than 5 million square kilometers, from North Africa to Britain, from the Atlantic to Mesopotamia. 1 in every 4 human beings lived under Rome's shadow, and that shadow had a price. Because Rome didn't govern only with armies. It governed with laws, with roads, with currency, with spectacle, and above all, with an idea that Rome was civilization and everything outside it was barbarism. This narrative wasn't just propaganda. It was architecture, it was religion, it was language. Rome didn't conquer territories. Rome absorbed worlds. But within this grandeur was something few want to see, a profound instability at the center of power. The Roman imperial system had no clear rule of succession. There was no constitution. There was no formal limit to what an emperor could do. In practice, the throne belonged to whoever had enough strength to take it, and enough cruelty to keep it. This meant that politics in Rome wasn't a game of ideas. It was a game of survival. Senators conspired, generals calculated, emperors distrusted everyone around them, because distrust was, almost always, justified. It's in this scenario that Roman Stoicism is born, not as an abstract classroom theory, but as a necessity. An interior survival technology for men who lived surrounded by uncontrollable power. Stoic philosophy had already existed for centuries, since Zeno of Citium, around 300 BC in Greece. But when it arrived in Rome, something changed. Stoicism stopped being just one philosophical school among others. It became the moral language of the Roman elite. Some historians argue this happened precisely because Stoicism offered something no other philosophy offered so clearly. A method to maintain dignity in a world where everything could be taken from you at any moment. Your wealth, your position, your family, your life. Stoicism said, there's something no one can take. Your reason, your capacity to choose how to respond to what happens. your inner freedom. And that was exactly what a young man born in Corduba, in Roman Hispania, around 4 BC, would test to the most extreme limits life can offer. His name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca. History would know him as Seneca the Younger. And before he became the most read, most quoted, and most controversial philosopher of ancient Rome, before Nero, before exile in Corsica, before the letters to Lucilius, before the philosophical suicide that would forever mark the image of Stoicism. He was just a sick, ambitious boy, fascinated by the power of words. But Rome already had plans for him, and Rome never asked permission. Seneca wasn't born in Rome. This is a detail that's often lost, but it matters more than it seems. He was born in Corduba, present-day Cordoba, in southern Spain, one of the oldest and most Romanized cities of the Iberian Peninsula. Cordoba wasn't just any peripheral colony. It was an administrative, cultural, and commercial center. A city that had absorbed Rome so deeply that, in many ways, it considered itself more Roman than the Romans themselves. And Seneca's family was exactly that: provincial, ambitious, and obsessed with Rome. His father, Seneca the Elder, also called Seneca the Rhetorician, was a man fascinated by the art of oratory. He wasn't a philosopher. He wasn't a politician. He was an equestrian class intellectual who dedicated his life to studying, cataloging, and teaching rhetoric. He wrote entire treatises analyzing the greatest orators of his time, their techniques, their tricks, their failures. This is important, because young Seneca didn't grow up in a house of philosophers. He grew up in a house of words, in a house where language was power, where mastery of the right phrase at the right moment was treated as the most valuable skill a Roman man could possess. And there was a practical reason for this. In imperial Rome, rhetoric wasn't an ornament. It was the gateway to public life. It was the instrument that transformed a provincial into a senator, an unknown into a figure of influence. Words were the ladder. Seneca's father knew this, and he wanted his sons to climb. Seneca had 2 brothers, the eldest, Novatus, who would later adopt the name Gallio and become proconsul of Achaia, even appearing in biblical texts, and the youngest, Mela, who would avoid public life but father a son history wouldn't forget. The poet, Lucan. 3 brothers, 3 radically different destinies, but all shaped by the same force, the ambition of a provincial family that saw in Rome not just an empire, but an opportunity. Still young, Seneca was taken to Rome by his maternal aunt. And here, the first blow. Seneca was sick, chronically sick. He suffered from severe respiratory problems. Some historians suggest severe asthma, others a form of tuberculosis. Seneca himself would later write about these episodes with surprising honesty. He described crises so intense they left him on the brink of death. He described moments when the only thing preventing him from killing himself was the suffering it would cause his father. This isn't a minor biographical detail. This is foundational. Because when Seneca writes, decades later, about the shortness of life, about the urgency of living with purpose, about not wasting the time we've been given, he's not philosophizing in the abstract. He's speaking as someone who felt death's breath on his neck before he turned 20. Someone for whom each day was, literally, a day that might not have existed. The illness forced him to spend a long period in Egypt, in his aunt and uncle's house. His uncle was prefect of Egypt at the time. Some scholars argue that during this period Seneca had his first deep contact with ascetic practices and Eastern philosophies that may have influenced his later thinking. But this remains debated. What we know with more certainty is that Egypt gave him time to read, time to reflect, and time to develop what would make him different from any other orator in Rome: the ability to unite rhetoric with philosophical depth. When he returned to Rome, already a young adult, Seneca plunged into philosophical studies with rare intensity. He studied with masters from different schools. Attalus, the Stoic, who deeply impressed him with his moral rigor. Sotion, who followed a Pythagorean tradition and convinced him, for a time, to adopt vegetarianism, and Papirius Fabianus, a philosopher and rhetorician who combined eloquence with simplicity of life. It's a curious thing, and revealing. Seneca didn't form within a single school. He absorbed multiple influences, tested different practices, experimented. Some historians of philosophy, like Brad Inwood, argue that this eclectic formation explains both the richness and the inconsistencies of Seneca's thought. He was never an orthodox Stoic. He was a Stoic who thought with tools borrowed from everywhere. And perhaps that was his greatest strength, or his greatest weakness, depending on who you ask. What no one denies is that, upon returning to Rome, Seneca was brilliant. His oratory drew attention almost immediately. He began to advocate, make public speeches, move in circles of power with a skill his father would have deeply admired. But Rome was a place where talent alone wasn't enough, and where excessive brilliance could be as dangerous as incompetence. The emperor in power was Caligula, and Caligula, according to accounts by ancient historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, didn't admire talents that could overshadow his own. There's an account, whose exact veracity is debated, that Caligula became so irritated with Seneca's eloquence that he considered having him killed. He was supposedly dissuaded only by someone who assured him that Seneca was so sick he would die soon anyway. Whether this happened exactly this way, we don't know. But what we do know is what the episode reveals about the world Seneca operated in. A world where being too good at what you do could cost you your life. A world where adversity wasn't a philosophical metaphor. It was the air you breathed. And Seneca breathed deeply. He survived Caligula. He saw the emperor assassinated in 41 AD, but what came after wasn't relief. What came after was Claudius. And with Claudius came the first great catastrophe of Seneca's life. A catastrophe that would take him far from Rome, far from power, far from everything he knew, and that, paradoxically, would transform him into the philosopher the world would never forget. Exile arrived in 41 AD, and it arrived the way things always arrived in Rome. Suddenly, without warning, and for reasons that had less to do with justice than with political convenience. The official accusation: adultery with Julia Livilla, niece of Emperor Claudius. The punishment: relegation to the island of Corsica for an indefinite period. Now, we need to stop here, because the question of adultery is, to this day, one of the most obscure points in Seneca's biography. Was there really an affair between him and Julia Livilla? Some historians believe so. Others argue the accusation was fabricated by Messalina, Claudius's wife, who saw Julia Livilla as a political rival and wanted to eliminate her from court. Seneca, in this reading, was merely collateral damage, a convenient name to give credibility to the plot. The truth? We'll probably never know. What we do know is the result. Seneca was torn from Rome and thrown onto one of the most isolated islands in the Mediterranean. First-century Corsica wasn't what it is today. There was no charm, no tourism, nothing that resembled Roman civilization. For a man accustomed to Rome's intellectual circles, to public life, to philosophical debate, Corsica was a stone tomb surrounded by sea. And it was exactly there that something transformed. In the first years of exile, Seneca wrote texts that reveal a broken man. Consolation to my mother Helvia is in many ways one of the most honest letters he ever produced. In it, he tries to console his mother for his absence. But what shows through, beneath the Stoic rhetoric, is the pain of someone who doesn't know if he'll return. Who doesn't know if he'll see his family again, who is trying, with all the philosophical tools he possesses, not to fall apart. But there's another text from this period that's less noble, and therefore more revealing. Consolation to Polybius is addressed to a powerful freedman in Claudius's court. Polybius had lost a brother, and Seneca seized the opportunity to write a consolation letter that is, in practice, a disguised plea. The text praises Claudius so exaggeratedly, so servilely, that generations of scholars have been divided on how to interpret it. Some, like classicist Emily Wilson, argue that this text reveals Seneca's most pragmatic and perhaps most desperate side. A philosopher who preached detachment from fate and indifference before fortune, begging between the lines to return to the center of power. Hypocrisy, perhaps, or perhaps something more complex, because the Corsican exile lasted 8 years. 8 years, and 8 years on an island with no prospect of return, do things to the human mind that no philosophical theory prepares you to face. What we know is that, in those 8 years, Seneca also wrote. A lot. He read, he reflected. He deepened his thinking about time, about death, about adversity. Some scholars suggest that it was in exile that Seneca's Stoicism stopped being merely intellectual and became visceral, a philosophy tested in the flesh, not just in books. And then, in 49 AD, everything changed again. Messalina fell. She was executed after a failed conspiracy. And Claudius's new wife was Agrippina, a woman history would record as one of the most calculating figures of the Roman Empire. Agrippina had a son from a previous marriage, a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. The world would know him as Nero, and Agrippina needed a tutor for him, someone cultured, eloquent, respectable, someone who could give her son the appearance of virtue and intellectual preparation that would justify placing him on the throne. Someone who, having been exiled and humiliated, would be in debt, and, therefore, controllable. Seneca was perfect. He was called back to Rome. Overnight, the exiled philosopher in Corsica became tutor to the future emperor of Rome. From the remotest margin of power to its absolute center, from irrelevance to maximum influence. And here begins the most controversial and most fascinating chapter of Seneca's life. Because what happened in the following years wasn't just the education of a prince, it was an unprecedented philosophical wager. Seneca believed, or at least seemed to believe, that it was possible to shape a just ruler, that philosophy could be more than theory, that Stoic ethics, applied at the center of power, could transform the way Rome was governed. In 54 AD, Claudius died, poisoned, according to most ancient sources, by Agrippina's order, and Nero, only 16 years old, became emperor. Seneca, alongside Praetorian prefect Burrus, took on the practical government of the Roman Empire. And here, something that's often lost needs to be said clearly. The first 5 years of Nero's reign, the so-called Quinquennium Neronis, were, by practically all accounts, a period of good governance. Tax reforms, political moderation, respect for the Senate, reduction of executions. Some historians argue this period was the direct work of Seneca and Burrus, that Rome, for a brief moment, was governed by a Stoic philosopher behind the scenes. This is extraordinary, if you think about it. A man who wrote about tranquility of the soul and control of human passions was, in fact, administering the largest empire in the world. The wealth and power Seneca accumulated during this period were immense. Properties, lands, interest-bearing loans in distant provinces. Some estimates suggest he became one of the richest men in the entire empire. And it's here that tension sets in. Because how do you reconcile the philosopher who wrote On the Shortness of Life, about not wasting life on empty pursuits, with the politician who accumulated wealth on an obscene scale? How do you reconcile the Stoic who preached indifference to fortune with the imperial advisor who lived surrounded by it? Critics pointed out this contradiction even during his lifetime. The philosopher Publius Suilius, according to Tacitus's account, publicly attacked Seneca, asking by what principle of wisdom he had accumulated 300 million sesterces in just 4 years of imperial friendship. Seneca had an answer, and it's an answer worth examining. For him, wealth itself wasn't the problem. The problem was the relationship one has with it. The Stoic doesn't need to be poor. He needs to be capable of losing everything without destroying himself. Practical wisdom for Seneca didn't require renunciation. It required inner freedom, the capacity to use wealth without being used by it. It's an elegant position, sophisticated, and profoundly convenient for someone who was, at that moment, fabulously wealthy. But here's the question that lingers, and has lingered for 2,000 years. Was he right, or was he deceiving himself? Because while Seneca wrote about virtue and reason, the boy he'd been called to educate was changing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but changing. And no one, not even Rome's most brilliant philosopher, could control what Nero was becoming. The change didn't happen all at once. It never does. That's the detail most people don't understand about imperial corruption. It doesn't arrive like lightning. It arrives like a tide. Slow, steady. When you realize it, you're already submerged. Nero didn't wake up one day and decide to be monstrous. There was a process, and Seneca was present at every stage of it. The first sign came with Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, whom many considered the legitimate heir to the throne. In 55 AD, during a banquet, Britannicus died suddenly. He was 14 years old. Ancient sources, particularly Tacitus, suggest poisoning. Nero had supposedly planned everything with precision: the dose, the moment, the official excuse that the boy suffered from epilepsy. And Seneca? What did the great Stoic philosopher do in the face of the death of a teenager who was probably murdered by his pupil? Silence. There's no record of protest, no letter, no confrontation. What there is continuity. Seneca continued at Nero's side, continued governing, continued writing about virtue. Now we need to be careful here. Some historians argue that Seneca may not have known the details. Others suggest he knew, but calculated that his remaining in power was still the best way to contain the emperor, that leaving would abandon any possibility of moderating influence. This is the most generous interpretation. And it's an interpretation that, it must be said, many philosophers and political advisors throughout history would use to justify similar compromises. But there's another reading, harsher, more uncomfortable. The reading that Seneca, at that point, was already trapped. Not by chains, by circumstances, by accumulated wealth, by prestige, by the simple and brutal reality that in Rome, you didn't resign from an emperor's inner circle. You were dismissed or eliminated. The inner freedom that Stoicism promised was being tested, and the test was infinitely crueler than any philosophical exercise. After Britannicus came Agrippina. The relationship between Nero and his mother was always complex. Ancient historians describe it in tones ranging from suffocating control to, frankly, disturbing. Agrippina had placed Nero on the throne, and Agrippina expected to rule through him. When she realized she was losing influence, partly because of Seneca and Burrus, who drew Nero away from her orbit, she began to threaten. She began to suggest she could support Britannicus as an alternative. She began to play the game she had always played, and Nero decided the game ended there. In 59 AD, Agrippina was assassinated. The plan was elaborate, theatrical, and brutal. First, they tried to drown her in a ship that had been designed to collapse. She survived, swam to shore. Then Nero sent soldiers, and this time there was no escape. Nero's matricide is one of the darkest episodes in Roman history. And Seneca's role in it is, perhaps, the hardest stain to erase from his biography, because it was Seneca who wrote the letter to the Senate justifying Agrippina's death. He, the philosopher of virtue, the defender of reason, the Stoic who wrote about tranquility of the soul, drafted the official document that presented the murder of a mother by her own son as a necessary and justified act. Tacitus records that the Senate received the letter with discomfort, that many senators recognized Seneca's hand in the text, and that the reaction wasn't admiration, it was shame, not for the letter itself, but for the wasted talent, for eloquence placed in service of something no words could make acceptable. This is the moment when Seneca's narrative cracks, and it cracks in a way that never completely repairs. Because up to here, it was possible to defend the philosopher. It was possible to argue he was doing what he could within an impossible system, that his presence contained Nero, moderated excesses, protected lives. But after Agrippina, that defense becomes much more difficult. And Seneca knew. There are indications in later texts, in the letters to Lucilius, written in the following years, of a man who is trying, somehow, to account to himself. The letters are more urgent, more personal, more obsessed with the question of death and with the idea that true wisdom lies in knowing when to withdraw. Some scholars, like James Kerr, argue that the letters to Lucilius are, in part, an exercise in self-examination, that Seneca was using philosophical writing not to teach Lucilius, but to confront his own choices, to test whether the Stoic ethics he preached still survived inside a man who had done what he did. It's a fascinating possibility, and profoundly human. But Rome didn't wait for Seneca to resolve his internal dilemmas. Burrus died in 62 AD, probably of disease, though some sources suggest poisoning. With Burrus's death, Seneca lost his only real ally in Nero's circle, and Burrus's replacement was Tigellinus, a man Tacitus describes as the exact opposite of everything Seneca represented. Cruel, opportunistic, sycophantic. Tigellinus didn't want to moderate Nero. He wanted to feed him. Seneca understood what was happening. He asked to retire. He offered to return all his wealth to Nero. Tacitus records the scene with almost cinematic precision. Seneca, before the emperor, arguing that he had already received more than any advisor deserved, and that now he only wanted time to study and prepare for death. Nero refused. He embraced Seneca, said he didn't accept the return, that he still considered him his advisor. But a Roman emperor's embrace didn't always mean affection. Sometimes it meant, I still need you nearby, where I can watch you. Seneca partially withdrew from public life in the following years. He spent more time on his estates. He wrote with almost feverish intensity. The letters to Lucilius, 124 letters that have reached us, are from this period. And they are, by near consensus among scholars, Seneca's masterpiece, not just as philosophy, but as literature, as a record of a mind confronting its own contradictions with an honesty that, at minimum, demands respect. In them, Seneca speaks about self-control, about how to face adversity, about the difference between living and merely existing, about the weight of wasted time, about how death isn't something that happens at the end. It's something that happens every moment we're not truly present. And while Seneca wrote about presence and practical wisdom, Nero set Rome on fire. The Great Fire of 64 AD destroyed 10 of the city's 14 districts. Popular tradition says Nero played the lyre while the city burned. Probably a simplification, but one that captures something real about the emperor's disconnection from reality. After the fire, Nero needed culprits, and he found two targets. The first were the Christians, a still marginal sect that was brutally persecuted. The second, less immediate but equally fatal, was anyone who represented a threat, real or imagined, to his authority. And in 65 AD, the threat gained a name, the Pisonian conspiracy. A group of senators, knights, and officers planned to assassinate Nero and replace him with Gaius Calpurnius Piso. The conspiracy was discovered, and the list of accused included Seneca. It's unclear whether Seneca actively participated. Sources diverge. Tacitus suggests the conspirators tried to involve him, but that Seneca didn't confirm his adherence. Some modern historians argue he may have had knowledge without participating directly. Others believe Nero simply took the opportunity to rid himself of an advisor who no longer served and who knew too much. What we know is the result. Nero sent an officer to Seneca with a message that, in practice, was a sentence. And what Seneca did upon receiving it would forever transform how the world understands the relationship between philosophy and death. The centurion arrived at Seneca's estate when the philosopher was dining with his wife, Paulina, and two friends. The scene is described by Tacitus with a level of detail suggesting he had access to eyewitness accounts, or, at minimum, to an oral tradition very close to the events. The message was simple. Nero wanted to know if Seneca had participated in the Pisonian conspiracy. Seneca answered that he had not, calmly. The centurion returned to Nero with the answer, and Nero asked the officer, did he show fear, beg for mercy, try to flee? No sign of disturbance. Nero then sent the final order. Seneca should die, and following the Roman tradition reserved for citizens of high position, he was granted the right to choose the method. Seneca chose to open his veins. What happened in the following hours is one of the most narrated and most debated episodes in ancient history, and it needs to be told carefully because the line between historical record and narrative construction is, here, thinner than in almost any other moment of Seneca's life. According to Tacitus, Seneca received the order without surprise. He turned to his friends and said something that would echo for centuries, that they shouldn't be surprised, that he had lived his entire life preparing for this moment. That philosophy, all of it, every text, every letter, every reflection, had been, at bottom, a rehearsal for this hour. He asked for his tablets to write a final text. The centurion refused. Then Seneca turned to his friends and said that, since he couldn't leave them his testament, he would leave them the only thing he still possessed, and the most valuable, the example of his life. Paulina, his wife, wanted to die with him. Seneca tried to dissuade her. He said she should live, that there were reasons to continue. But Paulina insisted. She said she didn't want a world without him, and she opened her own veins beside her husband. Nero, learning of this, ordered that Paulina be saved, not out of compassion, but because a wife's death alongside her husband would transform Seneca into a martyr. And Nero didn't want martyrs. He wanted silence. The soldiers stanched Paulina's wounds. She survived, but, according to Tacitus, she lived the rest of her days with extreme pallor, as if the blood had never fully returned. One possible interpretation is that the damage was partially permanent. Another, more symbolic, is that Tacitus wanted to record that something died in her that night, even though the body continued. As for Seneca, death didn't come quickly, and here the narrative assumes an almost unbearable weight. Seneca's blood flowed slowly. He was old, about 69 years, and his years of illness and restricted diet had left his body thin, weak. The veins didn't bleed with the necessary speed. He also cut the veins in his legs. Still, death wouldn't come. He asked for hemlock, the poison that had killed Socrates centuries before. The reference wasn't accidental. Seneca wanted to die as Socrates had died. He wanted his death to be read as a continuation of that tradition, the philosopher who dies not because he was defeated, but because he refuses to live without dignity. The hemlock also didn't work. Seneca's body was so debilitated, circulation so compromised, that the poison didn't spread. Finally, he was taken to a hot bath. The steam and heat would accelerate blood loss. And it was there, in the steam, in the hot water, surrounded by weeping friends, that Seneca did the last thing he did in life. He kept talking. He spoke about the soul, about death, about what it means to live according to reason. His friends tried to record his words. Tacitus mentions that some of these records circulated afterward, though they haven't reached us. And then, slowly, Seneca stopped talking and died. Seneca's philosophical suicide became, almost immediately, one of the most powerful events in the history of Stoicism, and one of the most problematic, because Seneca's death can be read in two radically different ways. And the way you choose says something about what you believe philosophy is capable of doing. The first reading is the heroic one. Seneca lived as he could within an impossible system, made painful compromises, but in the final moment, when everything was taken, proved that inner freedom was real. He proved that Stoicism wasn't just words. He died with dignity, with presence of mind, citing Socrates, distributing wisdom until his last breath. Death redeemed life. The second reading is the tragic one. Seneca spent decades writing about virtue while serving a regime he knew was corrupt. He accumulated wealth while preaching detachment. He justified a matricide. And when death finally came, he turned even that into performance, into philosophical spectacle. Death didn't redeem anything. It merely completed the contradiction. And there's a third reading, perhaps the most difficult of all, the one that says both things are true at the same time. That Seneca was, simultaneously, a man of enormous moral courage and a man of enormous failures. That philosophical hypocrisy doesn't nullify the truth of what he wrote. That it's possible to teach something you can't fully live. And that doesn't make the teaching less valid. The philosopher Michel de Montaigne, 15 centuries later, would read Seneca with this complexity. For Montaigne, Seneca was neither a model to be imitated nor a hypocrite to be discarded. He was something rarer, a human being who tried, with imperfect tools, to live an examined life within circumstances that made it almost impossible. And perhaps that's the most honest lesson Seneca's story offers. Not that philosophy makes us perfect, but that philosophy is what remains when perfection is no longer possible. Nero survived 3 more years after Seneca's death. He ruled with growing paranoia, cruelty, and disconnection. In 68 AD, abandoned by his generals, by the Senate, by the Praetorian Guard, he tried to flee. He couldn't, and unable to kill himself alone, he asked a servant to help him drive the blade into his neck. His last words, according to Suetonius, "Qualis artifex pereo," what an artist dies with me. Until the end, Nero thought about himself. Seneca, until the end, thought about the soul. The difference between these two men, the pupil and the tutor, the emperor and the philosopher, isn't in the power they had. It's in what they did with the last seconds when that power no longer mattered. And Seneca's texts, the letters to Lucilius, the treatises on the shortness of life, on tranquility of the soul, on adversity, they survived. They crossed the fall of Rome. They were copied by medieval monks, rediscovered in the Renaissance, read by Montaigne, by Petrarch, by Erasmus. They reached the Enlightenment. They survived world wars. And today, 2,000 years later, they continue being published, translated, underlined, and discussed in practically every language on the planet. A man the Roman Empire tried to erase ended up lasting longer than the empire itself. But the question Seneca left behind, the question his texts raise without ever completely resolving, is more urgent now than it was in Rome. Open any bookstore today, physical or digital, and you'll find Seneca not hidden in the classics section, not dusty on an academic philosophy shelf. Seneca is in the display windows, in the bestsellers, in productivity apps, in personal development podcasts, in Instagram captions. Phrases like, "It's not that we have little time, it's that we waste a lot," circulate as if they were advice from a contemporary coach. Stoicism, a philosophy born in Greece over 2,000 years ago, has become, almost surprisingly, one of the most popular philosophical currents of the 21st century. And this isn't an accident. The path that brought Seneca here has a history. His texts survived Rome's fall thanks to copies made by Benedictine monks who, for centuries, preserved ancient manuscripts without necessarily agreeing with their pagan content, but recognizing in them something of moral value. In the Renaissance, Petrarch rediscovered the letters to Lucilius and treated Seneca almost as a soul companion, someone who spoke directly to the anxieties of his time. Montaigne absorbed him so deeply that some passages from the essays seem like direct responses to Seneca's passages. And in the Enlightenment, Stoic ethics influenced thinkers like Adam Smith, who saw in the idea of self-control and civic virtue something applicable to the morality of markets and nations. But the contemporary resurgence of Stoicism, what some call New Stoicism or Modern Stoicism, has its own characteristics. And this is where the story gets complicated. Thinkers like Massimo Pigliucci, professor of philosophy at City College of New York, and William Irvine, author of works on the practical application of Stoicism, have made a serious effort to rescue the depth of Stoic philosophy and present it as an ethical tool for the contemporary world. Pigliucci, in particular, argues that Stoicism isn't a productivity technique. It's a complete moral system with a vision of human nature, of the relationship between reason and emotion, of what it means to live well. On the other hand, there's a growing perception that much of what circulates today as Stoicism is a simplified version, sometimes unrecognizable, of the original philosophy. Phrases ripped from context, lists of Stoic habits for success, the idea that emotional control means emotional suppression, the reduction of an entire philosophical tradition to a personal optimization tool. And this tension between Stoicism as a philosophy of life and Stoicism as a consumer product raises a question Seneca would recognize immediately, because it's, at bottom, the same question he faced. Seneca lived at the center of power, surrounded by wealth, writing about virtue. Today, Stoicism is sold in hardcover books, promoted by influencers, and consumed by people who often seek not the transformation philosophy proposes, but the comfort of appearing transformed. Some critics point out that modern Stoicism risks becoming exactly what Seneca was accused of being, a facade of wisdom over a life that doesn't change. But there are those who argue the opposite. There are those who say that the fact that millions of people are, today, coming into contact with ideas about self-control, about the relationship with time, about the shortness of life, even in simplified form, is in itself something valuable. That the entry point matters less than the path traveled after it. That Seneca, if alive, probably wouldn't reject this popularization, because he himself was above all a communicator, someone who chose to write accessible letters, dialogues, and essays, not technical treatises. Someone who believed that philosophy that doesn't touch everyday life doesn't deserve the name philosophy. And this is where we arrive at the tension that really matters. Not the tension between ancient Stoicism and modern Stoicism, but the tension between what we know and what we do. Because that's the question Seneca left us. And it's the question that remains absolutely unanswered. We know, almost all of us know, that time is limited, that much of what consumes us daily has no real value, that how we react to what happens to us matters more than what happens to us, that there's a difference between being alive and really living. We know this. Seneca wrote about it 2,000 years ago, and we continue doing exactly what he warned us not to do. Why? That's the question. It's not a rhetorical question. It's a real philosophical question, and profoundly disturbing. Because if the problem were ignorance, Seneca would have solved it. The books would have solved it. The information is available. Practical wisdom is accessible as it never has been before in history. And yet, the distance between what we know and what we live doesn't seem to have diminished. Some contemporary philosophers, like Harry Frankfurt, with his work on the structure of will, or Akil Bilgrami, with his reflections on self-knowledge and agency, argue that the problem isn't intellectual, it's structural. That there's something in how we organize our lives, our economies, our systems of attention, that makes it systematically difficult to live according to what we know to be true. That it's not individual weakness, it's social architecture. Others, closer to the Stoic tradition, insist that responsibility is, in the end, personal. That Stoicism never promised that living with virtue would be easy, only that it was possible, and that difficulty is no excuse. Seneca would probably be somewhere between these two positions, because he lived both. He knew the weight of power structures that limit individual action. He operated within the most brutal of these structures for years, but he also insisted until the end that inner freedom was real. That reason could resist, that the human being could, even within a corrupt system, choose who to be. Did he prove it? Perhaps not in the way we'd like. His life is full of contradictions, concessions, and shadows. But his death, those final hours, the blood that wouldn't stop flowing, the words that wouldn't stop being spoken. His death suggests that, at minimum, he believed in what he taught, and that returns us to ourselves. Because the question was never really about Seneca. The question is about what we do with what we know, every day, in each choice that seems too small to matter, but that, added up, builds exactly the life Seneca warned us not to waste. Stoicism doesn't promise easy answers. Seneca even less so. What he offers, what he offered 2,000 years ago and continues offering now, is something at once more modest and more radical. The idea that examining one's own life isn't a luxury. It's the only thing that separates living from simply not having died yet. Seneca wrote 124 letters to Lucilius. In none of them did he say he had all the answers. In none of them did he pretend to have achieved the wisdom he pursued. What he did, letter after letter, day after day, was something simpler and braver. He kept trying. And perhaps that's what remains when the whole story is told. Not the image of the perfect philosopher, not that of the hypocrite, but that of a man who knew time was running out, and who chose, even so, to use what he had to think better, live with more attention, and leave something that would help others do the same. So the question that remains isn't about Seneca. It's about you. What are you doing with the time you know won't come back?